Hi, everyone. I'm Meg Isbitsky, Somerset County Mental Health Administrator, and welcome to Stigma-Free Stories, our video project where we discuss experiences of stigma as it relates to mental health and substance use with people who live and work in our very own Somerset County. So, the purpose of this project and our greater Stigma Free initiative is to spread education and public awareness in order to reduce negative stereotypes and promote acceptance, cohesion, and resources within our Somerset County community. So today I am here to talk with a Somerset County resident, Alessandra Gonzalez. So Alessandra, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure.
So do you mind just telling us a little bit about your story and how that brought you to where you are today?
Yeah, sure. So I personally have struggled with mental health my whole life. I would say I think my first instance of remembering it and it being really prominent in my life and becoming a severe issue was around 6 or 7. But growing up in the time that we did, I feel like the generation before us didn't really know what anxiety and depression and things like that were and the signs to look out for. So I had to learn to conquer the rest of my life with those things that I didn't even know were issues until probably my early 20s when I was officially diagnosed with my mental disorders. And from there, it was never a linear journey to health and dealing with it. It was always a bumpy thing and an up and down road. But eventually, I got into therapy consistently, which was really important for me personally, and learning how to cope with the things in my life in that exact moment and not holding them in and dealing with them later, which is what I had learned to do because I didn't know how to handle things in the moment. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, what do you think that when you were younger and feeling all these feelings and not understanding them, what do you think would have helped you like throughout your journey?
Well, personally, of course, with stigma, there is not just stigma, I think, attached to the person with the disorder. I think a lot of times, especially in perspective and from the side of parents, it can be hard for parents to admit that there's something wrong with their children, right? So if I had been able to talk about how I was feeling openly and had the doors open to therapy and it not being such a stigmatized taboo thing in my family, I'm sure that it would have taken me a shorter journey to get to the point where I am today of being able to handle and cope with my mental disorders because that's all we can really do. And if I had that open to me and people were more willing to talk about it and the people around me were talking about it, I would have felt more at ease talking about how I was feeling if everyone else around us was doing the same.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think with parents, especially, it's so multi-tiered because not only is it like you might just not even know what's going on, or you're attributing it to development or age or just being a bad kid, whatever. But then there's also that stigma, like you said, about that reflection on the parent. Like, what did the parent do wrong? And so that's a whole nother layer of difficulty. So absolutely, I think acknowledging that and teaching like those skills and those symptoms and what to look out for, that spares a lot of youth now, I think, today, thankfully.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think with our parents, they weren't dealing with their own issues too. So it's important to acknowledge those within yourself if you're going to be able to help anybody else, especially your kids. So them understanding their own mental disorders was something that was lacking, I feel, from their generation because of their parents and so on and so forth. And that's why I think it's really important that we discuss this and it's more openly accepted throughout every age range, every part of society, so that people don't struggle long term quietly and things get out of hand and they could have been resolved a lot sooner, you know?
Absolutely. And like the isolation and the shame and just the unknown, if we can break that cycle a little bit sooner and just spare people from some of that suffering, that's really what
Yeah,
we're trying to do here. So I know
absolutely.
that you just said that you kind of felt your own change or shift in your early 20s. Do you mind kind of telling us what happened that made you say, like, I need to make a change or I need to, accept something that's going on?
So I have very high functioning depression, and I'd say personally, all of my disorders, I think they would be classified more in the high functioning area. So, in order to keep the appearance of being okay and on top of everything, I found really destructive ways to cope, and that was substance abuse, particularly alcohol for me. So it became a point where I couldn't hold everything together while also abusing this drug, which is what it was, to keep myself together. And it became a problem when I was dropping the ball on things financially, and it became so overwhelming that I no longer wanted to live. And my mom, and I'm so lucky, I had family and people close to me that noticed that that wasn't who I had been the majority of my life, that I needed help but didn't know how to reach out to ask me because I personally didn't even know it was wrong. I think that I was 19 when I realized something was wrong, but that's when I started coping with things. And towards the end of my college career, it just blew up in my face because the more you suppress and the more it mounts on you, the worse it gets. So I was kind of lucky enough to be forced out of the situation I was in by my mom, but that also wasn't an immediate like change or immediate like switch for me. It took me about, I would say, 4 years until I was 25 to really come to terms with my diagnoses and that this was going to be a long-term thing, that no matter how much I could stop using alcohol to cope and how much I could function and get a good job and have relationships, that this was something I was going to have to learn to maintain forever. And that was around 25 years old when I really realized that therapy needed to be a consistent thing, talking about this needed to be a consistent thing, and just acknowledging it needed to be. But like I said, it wasn't easy, and it was only until everything came crashing around me did I really have to be forced to get the help that I needed.
Absolutely. Which
Yeah.
so grateful that you did, because like you said, at that point, like when you're in crisis or you're so deep in this pain, nobody's going to go pick up a phone book and rifle through mental health resources. Like you're not at that point where you can address it that way. So that's why having those social supports is so important, that your family was there and your friends knew, and not even that they necessarily knew what to look out for clinically measuring it against a diagnosis, but for them to notice something's different, something's wrong, and we have to intervene. That's a
Right.
blessing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the more that we discuss, like, I think for me personally, hearing other people talk about their struggles can like flip a switch in my head, like, okay, that's what I personally struggle with too. So it could be this. I encourage everybody to get diagnosed by a doctor, and self-diagnoses can be a little tricky, but um when you start hearing other people struggle with the same things around you and you have a name and something to tackle, it definitely becomes a lot easier versus just feeling clobbered by these feelings that you didn't even know what to label them as. So, how can you conquer a problem if you have no idea what you're even trying to conquer? So, it becomes a little bit too much, and why these open discussions are so important, so that even people who don't struggle maybe with their own mental health disorders, but the other people in their lives can recognize these signs and these symptoms to these disorders and in their own loved ones, and get them the help they need when they can't do it for themselves. Because that's, I think, one of the biggest underlying problems is it's once it gets to that point where I personally was in, you can do it yourself, but it becomes a lot harder and it becomes a lot easier if other people around you are aware, for sure.
Oh, absolutely. And the unknown of not knowing, like just not understanding what you're experiencing, like that makes it so much more of a huge monster or a huge battle to fight. And it's so much more of a struggle to then figure out what the next step is and how to address it, and kind of how much it affects your life in so many different components. So that's why even just trying to find a diagnosis is a major, like almost accomplishment, just in terms of sorting through things and actually tackling the problem.
For
So
sure. And I think it comes back to stigma, like when we were talking about when I was a child, and just coming from the background that I do, where mental health isn't prioritized and therapy is something that people don't do. And if they do, it's a very quiet and hush hush, that I thought that it was my duty to just handle these things on my own. So then I felt like there was something wrong with me because I couldn't do that by myself, because it was overtaking me. So when it did get to the point where I couldn't use substances anymore because they were taking over my life and negatively affecting me, in those moments, that then I started to realize that this was way bigger than me, and that it was way bigger than anything that I could do by myself. And I think that if you're feeling that way, it's really important to reach out. And we're so lucky that we have services like this in places that we can actually access information to just, get the ball rolling. And the first steps are so important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for all that. And I think it's so important to
Of
know,
course.
yeah, having these conversations just makes it hopefully a little bit easier for the next person that feels like they're unique in feeling isolated and depressed and scared and anxious and all of these symptoms, that that they feel like something's wrong with them, because that's one of the biggest stereotypes. I mean, I think we've done as a society a lot in terms of stigma, that we can even have this conversation right now, and that this is something that we have the ability and the infrastructure to advocate for. But there's still so much out there that's kind of being pushed in our face, that tells us that needing a therapist or needing medication or needing any of these supports means something about us that we aren't capable of doing for ourselves. And that's, to me, I think like the biggest thing that we should tackle, because we don't say that to people who need medical care, who need anything else in any other dimension of their lives. So having that belief that that doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you. In fact, quite the opposite, looking at it as an opportunity to strengthen yourself or your loved one, your family member. Like, to me, that's beautiful, that shift. So thank you for saying that.
Of course. I think mental health can be forgotten, that it is about your health, and that with it, your physical health can be completely affected by your mental health too. So if we're ignoring that and we're not prioritizing it, that's when I personally think it can become dangerous to you.
Mhm. Absolutely. Absolutely. So thank you for so much for your advocacy. What made you want to use your own story and your own perspective to be an advocate, or to spread education and awareness?
So I personally experienced a trauma in college. I was sexually assaulted, and it took me about 4 years to even come to terms with the fact that that had happened to me. And that was due to the stigma against survivors and victims of assault, and the shame that I felt and the guilt that I felt really took a toll on me. And I directly attribute that to a lot of the struggling that I did endure during that time period where I was depressed and abusing alcohol, because I didn't understand that it wasn't my fault, and I carried a lot of guilt. And when I recognized what had actually happened to me and that I was a victim, I vowed that I would talk about it so openly, just in hopes that one person would get the help and understanding that they needed to tackle it and heal. Because if I hadn't recognized that it wasn't my fault, I honestly don't know that I'd be here today. So I just genuinely believe it's so important that we openly discuss these things and make it okay to talk about, and that people, I really think it can save people's lives to just have a little bit more understanding in these areas and openly discuss them. It's really so important. And I know they're not easy subjects to discuss, and they can be very triggering, but I do think that they are extremely important. They're of the utmost importance. And I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try to help and somebody not feel that way. And 4 years is too long. 4 minutes is too long for anybody to feel like that. So if I can avoid that for anybody to go through, I will do anything I can, honestly.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for disclosing that. That's using your experiences and your pain to try to alleviate that from somebody else is very noble. So I appreciate that.
Thanks. Of
And
course.
my final question is, I'm just curious from your perspective, what is something that you wish the greater community knew just about mental health and addiction?
Yeah, I think mental health, I think we're doing a little bit better of a job in that area, where I feel like kids are starting to learn a little bit more about it. And these conversations are people are openly discussing them. My issue, and I think the hardest thing for me to keep hearing about, is the stigma against people with that suffer with addiction, and that there's something wrong with them, or that they're less than, and that they don't deserve the same treatment as anybody else with a medical condition. So I just really hope that people can understand that it could happen to anybody. It's something that just can overtake you in the blink of an eye, and there's nothing wrong with that person. There, you have no idea what could lead somebody down that path, and the hurt that they've endured, or even just the chemical genetic makeup of their DNA. These are illnesses that affect you just like any other. And I think that is the biggest takeaway for me, because if you had looked at me at that time, you wouldn't have realized that I was struggling. And I think that it's because people don't understand truly what addiction is and how it looks, that it's not always um the bottom point, where you're above, where you're living, where you're not living to your potential, et cetera, et cetera. It can be literally anybody. Functioning addiction is a thing, and it's around us, and people hear you say the things that you do, and they may be struggling with it, and you may be pushing them away not knowing. So I just think people can go a lot further in this life, especially regarding this subject, with a little more understanding and compassion towards it, for sure.
Absolutely.
That's what I hope that everybody can take from this.
And you touched on a really important point of just understanding that it could be anybody in our community, ourselves, our loved ones, our coworkers, and our neighbors. And so it's up to us to treat everybody by with respect, and assuming that everybody has a struggle, everyone's has gone through something that we need to just be more empathetic and more understanding towards. So thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, of course.
And thank you to everyone at home who is watching. To learn more about stigma and what you can do to play your part to help reduce it, please visit our website. Thank you.